Honourable members, I'm about to give the call to the Honourable Margaret Rowe, and before I do so, I should point out that it is her first speech, and I think we all know how to behave. So, Honourable Margaret Rowe.
Thank you, Mr. President. As an incoming Member of Parliament, it gives me pleasure to address you first with a quote from an outgoing Member of Parliament, the Honourable Bill Stretch, who, after 22 years in this place, said, "It is not the huge things one does in the electorate for which a member will be remembered, because there are few opportunities for us to change the world. The majority of the time of members is spent rescuing ordinary people and small businesses from the inevitable grind of bureaucracy. It is important to realise that this happens whichever party is in government, because the very process of government is a slow and clumsy business. It is not like the law. It does not grind exceedingly fine. It grinds exceedingly rough at times. After 13 years as a Greenwich Shire councillor, 2 of them as Deputy President, and 10 years as an electorate officer, I know too well the frustrations and the inequities endured by some people in their dealings with bureaucracy. It has been said that the wind speaks not more sweetly to the giant oaks than to the least of all the blades of grass. However, whilst giant oaks might topple if they are not well rooted to the earth, a lesson for those of us in this lofty place, the grass is walked upon every day. The electorate office is the grassroots ear to the world. That is why I have chosen to locate my electorate office in Geraldton, in the country. Like many regional centres, Geraldton has a proud history. I follow in the footsteps of Edith Cowan, OBE, the first woman elected to Parliament in Western Australia, who was born in 1861 at Glengarry Station near Geraldton. The current Premier is a Geraldton boy. An outgoing member of this chamber, the Honourable Derek Tomlinson, taught literature at the Geraldton Senior High School. Award-winning author Randolph Stowe was born in Geraldton and immortalised the town in his book Merry-Go-Round in the Sea. Tim Winton's novel Cloud Street has its origins in Geraldton. Actor Ernie Dingo was born at Bullaroo Station and studied at Geraldton Senior High School. Another famous Aborigine, Wurrundi, was born on the Murchison around the 1830s and was anointed as King Billy by Governor Weld. Western Australian Premier John Forrest is said to have given him a room in his Perth bungalow whenever he required one. I, however, am currently homeless. I understand, Mr. President, that it may be several months before my permanent electorate office is leased and furnished. Perhaps this is inadvertently fortuitous, as it will give me time to begin to know the broad expanse of my electorate. This will take some time, as it stretches from Kalbarri in the north to Esperance in the Great Southern. It comprises 68 local governments and in excess of 90,000 constituents. I am fortunate to share this responsibility with the Honourable Bruce Donaldson and the Honourable Anthony Fells. I noted that in his inaugural address in 1993, the Honourable Bruce Donaldson observed the reluctance of most Western Australians to settle beyond the Great Darling Scarp. This continues today, with the majority of people clinging to the long strip which hugs the coastline. How much do they know about life on the other side of the hill? My country experiences go back a long way. I was born and educated in Kalgoorlie, where my family ran a small business, and understand firsthand the issues affecting families who live in remote areas. As the second eldest in a family of 7 children, I am well aware of the challenges faced by large families in rural environments. My colleague, the Honourable Anthony Fells, has already spoken extensively about Esperance in his inaugural speech. I have chosen to base myself in Geraldton because I have already established a close relationship with the community. In fact, I worked for 12 years with the Midwest Development Commission. I also chose Geraldton as my base, as it has some important common links with other parts of the agricultural region. Like Kalbarri and Esperance, it has a significant fishing industry. This has progressed from the pioneering days of tiny wooden boats to the current multi-million-dollar high-technology industry. Even in the 50s, the fishermen still had no easy communication with land. They said goodbye to their families and set up camp for months on the Abrolhos Islands. The wives and families stayed in port, waiting for messages sent back on the carrier boat. In the evening, they tuned into the local radio station for the Fisherman's Request program, when their families could send them a brief message. These days, the boats are sophisticated, high-powered and high-tech. The skippers and their deckies can speak to their families and conduct their business with the push of a button. They can read the bottom of the ocean like a map and track their catch. Their bounty feeds an international trade. Salt water is in their blood, and often their children will finish university or some landlubber's job and come home to work the boat. These fishermen still brave the open sea, especially those on the Great Southern Ocean, and live with danger to pull their pots, set their wet lines or trawl their nets. They are the farmers of the ocean. In port, the farmers of the land battle their own problems with salty water. I was therefore pleased to see that the government last week, after some prompting by the opposition, recommitted to spending $315 million in joint Commonwealth and state funds on programs which will include salinity control. But Geraldton has more than salt water in common with the rest of my extensive electorate. It also has a hinterland of mixed farming, mainly grain and sheep. Whilst people in the city tend to take for granted the fruit, vegetables, processed grains and trays of meat in our supermarkets, we often forget that these can tell a story of a family which has waited with eyes turned to the sky for the first drops of rain, or cursed the downpour at shearing time, or watched a crop, lush and ripe and ready to harvest, laid flat by hailstones. We don't think about the farmer driving around all night in a dark paddock, ploughing and seeding. We don't think about the farmer carting hay to hand feed sheep and then having to sell them off or take the gun to them when the drought in the bank matches the drought in the paddocks. We don't think about the country children waiting at the farm gate for a bus, which takes them 30 or more kilometres to the little school in their nearest town. We forget that women are more likely to die of breast cancer and men are more likely to die of prostate cancer if they live in the country. We don't think about the road trauma victims having to be flown to Perth for treatment, away from their family support. We close our eyes to the terrible statistics in Aboriginal infant mortality and morbidity. We cannot bring ourselves to think about the high rate of rural youth suicide. We forget that whilst we idealise, farmers have to survive the politics and the realities of controversial issues such as the live sheep trade, GM crops, and mulesling protests and the flatulence tax on animals. We prefer to remember the days when the country rode on the back of a sheep and farmers reputedly charged around the paddocks in their Rolls Royce with a ram or two in the back. Those days were short and they are gone. The Deputy Prime Minister is quoted this week as saying Australia is in danger of running out of farmers in a decade because conditions on the land are so difficult. He was speaking in response to the drought crisis in the eastern states, but what will be the extra pressure on Western Australian farmers if those farmers collapse? Will WA farmers find themselves carrying the load of the nation? Will our farmers be able to survive without tax incentives for drought-proofing their properties, land improvement and that old killer, transport subsidies? According to the Western Australian Farmers Federation, at least half the farmers in WA are battling the cost price squeeze. It is not that farmers are not working hard. ABS statistics show that in 2001, 59% of farmers worked 49 hours or more per week, compared with 19% of all employed people who spent this amount of time working per week. And farmers often work beyond the traditional retirement age, with 15% of farmers aged 65 and over in 2001. Indeed, the proportion of farmers aged 65 years and over is greater than the proportion aged less than 35 years. Fewer young people are becoming farmers. The Farmers Federation says that the issues of business imperative and succession planning is a key risk for WA primary industry if it is not addressed. Perhaps it is the quiet pride and tenacity of our farmers and graziers, their remarkable capacity for economic survival in a changing global weather system and volatile international market, which allows us to live our illusions about the good life. The reality is that farmers have no paycheck in the bank each fortnight, and even where there is a fortnightly paycheck in the letterboxes of the small margin of towns which service these farmers, the income and employment security in the town depends on the wool clip, or the amount of grain which goes into the local silos, or the size of the catch. Country WA also owes much of its existence to small business, retail, commerce, hospitality, and government-based health, education and housing employment. We must recognise and support the retention of these townships and the small business model. I'm pleased to say, however, there are some encouraging signs. Major findings from the 2003-2004 ABS survey include an overall increase in wheat production, with Western Australia showing one of the largest state increases, up 174%, a welcome relief after the 2002 drought when production was effectively halved. Lamb and sheep numbers also show signs of some recovery from the low of the previous year, with the largest increases reported in New South Wales and in Western Australia. Our state was up 4% to $24.8 million. This is a credit to our farmers, given that over 80% of agriculture production is exported. And in a globalised marketplace, farmers are the price takers rather than the price setters. All this effort and risk for 20-cent return on the $3 price of a loaf of bread. On the other hand, real estate agents in my electorate are getting better returns. Because of the high cost of housing in the eastern states is driving investors west. The City of Geraldton and Shire of Greenock are booming with some of the hottest real estate in the state. Esperance and Kalbarri have some of the most beautiful coastlines and spectacular gorges in the nation and are attracting thousands of visitors. Geraldton now has more visitors per annum than Broome. One of my great passions is tourism, and this was heightened when I served as chairman of the Shire's Standing Committee for Tourism and Community Development. We have seen the tourism explosion in the southwest and our far north, and I believe that the Midwest will be the next to experience this growth when the Indian Ocean Drive is completed. All that remains is approximately a 40-kilometre section between Lancelin and Durian Bay, and I intend to work stridently for the completion date to be brought forward. It is not surprising that city dwellers are drawn to refuel their souls in the country, not just because of the open skies and big horizons, but also because of the people. The strength of the family unit has served the agricultural region well and has my support and respect. Mr. President, I congratulate you on your election to President of this House and to the Honourable George Cash on his re-election as Chairman of Committees in the Legislative Council. I would like you to know that whilst I appreciate the privilege and the protocols of this House, I am under no illusion that being a Member of Parliament is going to be glamorous. My introduction to my new role kept my feet well and truly on the ground. I door-knocked in temperatures in excess of 40-degree heat, lost 6 kilos and was bitten by a dog. The Liberal Party pre-selection committee must have recognised some tenacity in me, and I thank them sincerely for their faith. I thank all those people who assisted so capably and selflessly during my campaign, especially my family and friends, for their love, support and friendship. Whilst there are too many to mention everyone by name, I would like to record my particular thanks to my father, Arch Trahere, my son Bradley, and his partner Rebecca, my daughter Donna and her partner Hotchie, sorry about this, Mr. President, my wonderful grandchildren, Hannah, Jonah, Ruby and Daisy, as well as my close friends, Bill Perry and Kim Stokes. So what brings me to this place? Whilst I always felt I had made a contribution to the community as a Shire councillor, an electorate officer and sportsperson, I felt I could make a more extensive contribution as a Member of Parliament. In this position, I can understand and ensure that my constituents receive their lawful entitlements, but I can also represent their views in how those laws are formulated and amended. According to the West Australian Farmers Federation, there are 31 acts with 86 high-level regulatory areas governing agriculture. In WA, most of these are under the jurisdiction of 2, sometimes 3 departments. The Westminster system of government is based on representation. I will be making no apology. I will be speaking for the bush. At a time when the country voice is smaller in Parliament, I will just have to speak more loudly. Mr. President, despite adversity in 2001-2002, the gross value of agricultural production in Western Australia was $5.5 billion. However, when all the other industries tied to agriculture are factored in, agriculture fuels in excess of 12% of the state's GDP and between 17 and 20% of the jobs. The agricultural region is the heartland of Western Australia, and I am proud to speak on their behalf. I would like to think that when it comes my time to leave this house, I can rest comfortably with the words of poet Robert Frost. Somewhere, ages and ages hence, 2 roads diverged in the wood, and I took the one less travelled by, and that has made all the difference. Thank you.
Very good.